Hello and welcome everyone to this webinar, the Blue Economy CRC 7th webinar in the 2021 series. And we are today here to launch this report, Offshore Wind Energy in Australia. It's very exciting. We have over 600 attendees, which is really terrific. So welcome to you all. I'm Gunilla Burrows and I'm a board member of the Blue Economy CRC and have pleasure to facilitate this webinar this morning. I'd like to begin by acknowledging with deep respect the traditional owners of the lands on which each of us are coming to this webinar from. For me, it is the Awabakal people, the traditional custodians of the lands in the Newcastle, New South Wales area. They cared and protected this country and the surrounding seas for thousands of years and belong to the oldest continuing culture in the world. And I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us here today. So today is a special webinar because, as I've said, we're here to launch this report, Offshore Wind Energy as Australia, which is the culmination of some of our collaborative research and the outcome of one of our Pathfinder projects, or as we call them, scoping projects that we completed earlier this year. And we are very lucky to have several of the authors who will be speaking about the report's key findings today. But firstly, I'd like to say a few words about the CRC. So the Blue Economy CRC is, change the slide. The Blue Economy CRC is celebrating its second year anniversary, having been established in July 2019. It has a 10-year life under the Australian government CRC program. We have 40 participants, as you see here on the screen, from Australia and around the globe. In fact, we have 10 countries represented. And our purpose is to provide world-class, collaborative, industry-focused research and training that will underpin the growth of the blue economy through the increasing of offshore, sustainable aquaculture and renewable energy production. Now, this report that we are launching today is the outcome of one of those collaborative projects, where the Blue Economy CRC teamed up with our participants CSIRO and SciTech Offshore, along with the Institute of Sustainable Futures, University of Technology, Sydney, Maritime Union of Australia, with contributions from the Electrical Trade Union, Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, and the Australian Council of Trade Unions. I believe the quality and the importance of the work being presented today reinforces the value of this sort of industry-relevant cooperative research, which we're undertaking at the Blue Economy CRC, and points to the kind of positive opportunities and results that are created and will make a significant impact on the growth of the Australian blue economy. So before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. Firstly, to make sure that you see the presenters and their slides, please ensure you're on speaker view, which is up on the top right-hand corner of your screen. The plan today is that we're going to hold all the questions to the end to have, at the end of all of our speakers. So we'll have a longer panel Q&A session then. But please, can I encourage you right now to open that Q&A function at the bottom there. And if you would keep it open during the webinar, really appreciate you starting to put your questions up even while the speakers are talking. But also keep an eye on all the other questions that are coming up, because I really want to encourage you, if you can, to upvote questions or like them in that Q&A box, because that will actually bring the most popular questions up to the top, and it will be greatly appreciated by me and help me during that Q&A session that we can get through those popular questions. Can I please ask you only to use the chat if you're experiencing technical issues, and we've got Leslie online who's going to help with that, or if you want to speak to one of the panelists directly and not included in any of the Q&A discussions. And then finally, please go to your socials, not only during the webinar, but today, and use the hashtag Offshore Wind so that we can keep promoting this report and the work that's being done here. So now to the presenters. I have great pleasure actually in introducing now our whole panel. We have Michelle O'Neill, who has just come online. Thank you. I know you had a hard date to this 11 a.m. Mark Hemmer, Sven Teske and Chris Briggs. My plan is to introduce each of you before you speak. So I'm actually going to stop my sharing and introduce our first speaker. Michelle O'Neill is the president of the Australian Council of Trade Unions. Previous to this, Michelle was the branch and national secretary of the Textile Clothing and Footwear Union of Australia, where she has led campaigns to win world-leading rights for workers throughout the clothing supply chains. She was elected president of ACTU in 2018 and chairs their climate action group. So it's really lovely to have her here to open the discussion and hear her thoughts on offshore wind for Australia. So thank you to Michelle. Michelle, are you on mute still?
I am, Gunilla. Right. So my apologies for that. I was just saying thank you very much for that warm welcome, and great to be with you all today. And I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands we meet on all over the country today. I'm here in the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay all my respects to the elders past and present. And it always was and it always will be Aboriginal land. And thank you so much to the Blue Economy CRC and to the researchers and all the partners who've put together this very impressive report that we're dealing with today. I also, of course, want to recognise that many of you are in lockdowns of one type or another, including myself, and just to express my solidarity with everyone who's doing it tough around the country, and to recognise and acknowledge those workers who are on the front line of our response to COVID and are continuing to provide essential services throughout the pandemic and the crisis. And I'm really pleased to be presenting and representing the unions here today at the launch of this very important report. For many years in Australia, the orthodox thinking has been that an offshore wind industry would be neither necessary or viable. There's plenty of land for renewables, or our continental shelf is too steep, so the ocean's too deep for wind turbines, went the arguments. So I'm really pleased that some of our affiliates, and in particular the Maritime Union of Australia, part of the Construction, Forestry, Maritime Mining and Energy Union, continue to question and reassess that orthodoxy as the facts changed and as the case for climate action became even more compelling over the past decade. And importantly, the MUA also drew on the really deep knowledge of the electricity system held by the Electrical Trades Union, who have also been part of this project, and the understanding of local manufacturing and procurement that is brought and understood by the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, who have also been part of this project. They identified a gap in the knowledge about how offshore renewable resources could contribute to a renewable energy future in Australia and began looking to fill that knowledge gap. And one of the great strengths of the union movement has been that we're prepared to challenge prevailing attitudes when we see an opportunity to make life better for Australians. And it's that relentless pursuit of a better life and a better country for all that saw the union movement win equal pay for an equal day's work, retirement saving for workers through our superannuation system, and of course, most recently, JobKeeper to keep millions of Australians in employment during 2020. And in recent years, the economics of offshore wind generation have changed dramatically. Turbines have gotten larger, and we've got more experience in manufacturing and installing them globally. We now have floating wind turbines that make it possible to build offshore wind farms in deep water. Nations like Denmark have demonstrated that there are well-paid and secure jobs in the industry, from manufacturing to installation and servicing. And we're now seeing similar approaches under President Biden in the US. And perhaps the largest change to orthodox thinking is that instead of having a conversation about how renewable energy might provide 20 or 25% of our power in Australia, it's now both conceivable and in our best interests that not only is our electricity grid powered by renewable energy in years to come, but that Australia is using its outstanding renewable energy resources to manufacture energy-intensive products like hydrogen, steel, and aluminium, and export them to the world. As a union movement, we know that net zero emissions, renewable energy powered economy is necessary to limit the worst aspects of climate change. Impacts that Australian workers are all too familiar with, even in our current level of global warming. But we also know that the shift to zero emissions threatens to be painful and damaging for many workers and communities that have powered our economy for so long, particularly when, unlike many other countries, we have no national plan for a just transition for impacted workers and communities. That's why this report is so important. It finds Australia has an excellent offshore wind resource, with already around a dozen proposed new offshore wind farms, and that an offshore wind industry could play a significant role in a just transition for workers and their communities. Offshore wind requires many of the skills that workers in existing industries have, and can be built in places where workers have those skills. For example, Newcastle, Port Kembla, Gippsland, and Gladstone. Offshore wind can also provide large quantities of clean and consistent energy for industrial precincts in the Hunter Valley, Gippsland, and Central Queensland, Southwest WA, and Tasmania to make hydrogen and other intensive products, energy-intensive products. The analysis in this report also finds that offshore wind could create more ongoing secure jobs than other forms of renewable energy and generation, which to date in Australia have often fallen short of the standards that we would expect in terms of job security and conditions. This is a critical point for the union movement. We cannot understate how important it is that the jobs of the future are ones that working people, their families, and communities have confidence in. Good, quality, secure, safe jobs. Good, quality, union jobs. A project like Star of the South in Gippsland could provide 400 to 500 jobs per year over 5 years of construction, and then 270 jobs per year for the next 30 or more years of operations. There's more jobs again if we're manufacturing offshore wind components here in Australia. This is a huge opportunity for Australia and for Australian workers. Of course, this industry won't just materialise by itself. The report includes recommendations on the need to establish a regulatory regime for new projects, the need to incorporate offshore wind into national and state energy planning, and the need for funding to be provided for innovation and development. Also, the need for the permitting process for new projects to support the development of local supply chains. The ACTU was proud to support this project and to work alongside our affiliates at the MUA, the ETU, and the AMWU. We want to thank the Blue Economy CRC for recognising the need for this research and for hosting and co-funding it. We also want to thank researchers from the CSIRO, Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney, and the SATEC Offshore for your excellent work on this project. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with you. This is an important piece of research to support Australia's energy transition. It's an important piece of research to support Australian workers, their families, and communities. I'll now hand over to the research team to tell you more about the report's findings, but I look forward to working with you all to make this exciting new industry a reality. Thanks very much.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Michelle. What a beautiful overview and beautiful sentiments to start that better life and better future, and the importance of that just transition, absolutely critical. But as you say, let's get talking to some of the actual researchers on this work. And our first speaker on that is Dr. Mark Hemmer, who is our Principal Research Scientist at CSIRO Oceans and Atmosphere, and CSIRO's Program Coordinator for the Australian Climate Service. And for the Blue Economy CRC, he leads the Offshore Renewable Energy Systems Research Program, which is our Program 3. Mark is a meteorological oceanographer, recognised internationally by his research investigating climatological variability and change in marine wind and wave conditions, and the implications for marine and coastal industry, infrastructure, communities and environment. So he's well placed to provide insight into the offshore wind resources we have here in Australia, and to open up the technical side of the report. So over to you. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks very much, Gunilla, for that introduction, and also thank you to Michelle for that fantastic introduction to today's webinar and context. I don't think that any of us could have said it better, so thank you. It's a real pleasure today to be able to announce the release of our research on the opportunities for offshore wind in Australia. I'm going to go through and introduce the project and speak briefly on the availability of resource, and then I'll hand over to my colleagues at the University of Technology, Sydney, Sven, to speak about what that might mean in terms of the context for Australia's energy system, and then Chris to speak about the opportunities related to jobs. And Chris will also outline our recommendations from our report. So it's great to see the amount of interest in this webinar and the high attendance. And I think that kind of reflects that people are aware that offshore wind is booming globally. There's about 30 gigawatts of offshore wind installed globally now, with about 6 gigawatts were added the last year. This is predominantly across the UK with 10 gigawatts. Other EU nations that have other deployments across the North Sea, and then rapid growth in China. Increasingly, we're seeing more and more countries recognise the rapidly decreasing costs of offshore wind, and also the advantages of the consistent resource alongside onshore wind and solar. And so what we're seeing are more and more countries setting large targets for offshore wind deployment for 2030 and beyond. So we look here, the UK 40 gigawatt target by 2030, enough power to power all UK homes by 2030. Michelle just mentioned the targets being set by the Biden administration of 30 gigawatts by 2030. Large targets across the EU and significant targets being set across Asia. That opportunity is also being recognised in Australia. There's a significant amount of interest in the Australian offshore wind resource, and investment is very much knocking at the door. In our research, we identified over 15 offshore wind projects around Australia, and together they have a total capacity exceeding 35 gigawatts. For comparison, the total existing power plant capacity on the national electricity market at the moment is about 58 gigawatts, of which about 23 gigawatts is coal. Many people will be aware of the Star of the South project being the most advanced of those, and they're in the process of going through the draft scopes of the environmental assessments at the moment. I think as we look through this list of offshore wind projects for Australia, what's notable about them is the capacity of each of the projects being roughly 3, 4, 5 times larger than our typical onshore renewable energy projects. And that introduces key advantages in terms of the negotiations required for individual projects. But I think it's fair to say that despite the advantages of offshore wind that are being recognised internationally, that offshore wind hasn't been well captured in Australia's energy planning, research and development agendas. And that was really what this research sought to address. Internationally, we've seen offshore wind costs reducing rapidly and projected to continue, but recognition of this is relatively poorly captured in Australia's planning. On the left, we see the projected global weighted average offshore wind construction costs provided by the International Renewable Energy Agency, and that's in green, that band. In blue, we see the projected construction costs in the UK, where offshore wind is an established industry and proven itself as a commercial sector. While it's fair to assume that Australian projects will be at the higher end of those costs for the first couple of projects, we could anticipate that Australian projects will come into line with the global mean. But in red, we see the current costs that are assumed for offshore wind in the Australian context from the latest Gen Cost report, and see that they're roughly double what we're seeing in the international scene. On the right, we present the levelised cost of electricity projections that were presented by the UK government last year that suggest by 2030 offshore wind costs will be comparable with those onshore. And as onshore sites become exhausted in their context, offshore wind being able to exploit the higher quality resources offshore, using larger and larger turbines and access higher winds and more consistent winds. By the mid-2030s, they're actually projecting that offshore wind costs are cheaper than onshore wind. And so it's in that context that we established the research project, the scoping project with the Blue Economy CRC, to really stimulate discussion on the opportunity for offshore wind in Australia. As part of the research, we focused on 3 work packages, if you like. So firstly, it was undertaking a fairly high-level mapping of the national resource, and that's what I'll speak to. The second package was around assessing the generation profile of offshore wind and how this complements other generation technologies in a distributed energy system for Australia's system, and that's what Sven will speak to next. And then the third package was around profiling the workforce required of an offshore wind industry. And Chris will speak to that at the end of the session before wrapping up, reporting on our recommendations. And I encourage all attendees to head off to the link that's included there. Perhaps someone will include it in the chat to look at the report for yourselves. I want to acknowledge the research team that worked on this. We pulled together partners from within the Blue Economy CRC, from CSIRO, where I'm based, and SATEC Offshore, David on the right, and teamed up with third parties that included the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology in Sydney. Chris and Sven will speak from there shortly, and then others, Penny from the Maritime Union, Rusty from UTS, and Phil from University of Tasmania as well. And then I want to acknowledge the many other people who we've spoken to and contributed into the project in a whole range of forums. And so I really appreciate the input that we've had from lots of people in that respect. So to get to the resource, Australia has very high quality offshore wind resource. We sought to understand the quality of that in an international context and how that relates to where offshore wind has already proven itself commercially. So this is reflected by that map on the right. This is just a map of the global mean wind speed at the 100-metre level. We note that offshore wind turbines will be accessing winds typically higher than the 100-metre level now as they grow larger, but we use this as being indicative relative to what's available onshore. Areas where offshore wind is established include the North Sea, and in the bottom right figure there, you can see the location of wind farms in the North Sea and the East China Sea. And if we look at how the Australian resource compares to those locations, we see that particularly Southern Australia, that resource is as good or better than seen in these established zones. The other point I think to make from this slide is the resource relative to what's onshore. We often hear that Australia has magnificent onshore wind resources, but I think this slide clearly shows that what we're talking about in terms of the resource offshore is a next level again, and that's really something to take away from the opportunity for offshore wind. Next was to consider the quality of that resource in the context of the capacity factor. So here we consider only the gross capacity factor without considering any losses. And we assess the relative fraction of power that the IEA 15 megawatt reference turbine would generate a location around the Australian coast. You'll see white locations on the around the map of Australia there. They're either environmental constraints or areas where the wind was sufficiently low not to bother. So offshore wind presents a very consistent resource with gross capacity factors higher than 50% for much of the country, and what we see south of Tasmania is those factors exceeding 80% south of Australia. So we can look at offshore wind as being a very consistent resource, and if we compare it to onshore wind, for example, while we see offshore capacity factors exceeding 50% or so for large areas, we tend to see onshore gross capacity factors of about 35 to 45% as a maximum. And then the final slide that I want to talk about in terms of resource before I hand over to Sven was we were interested in the accessibility of the resource. In Michelle's introduction, she mentioned that one of the criticisms for offshore wind in an Australian context has been that our shelf is too deep and offshore wind isn't applicable to Australia. While this is a limitation for fixed foundation offshore wind turbines that have dominated deployments to date, we're now seeing the emergence of floating offshore wind farms that really removes this constraint and opens up huge areas of resource availability. In the UK, we now have a couple of commercial or semi-commercial floating offshore wind farms, and I think it was last week we saw China deploy their first floating turbines. And so this is going to be critical for the growth of the sector, and it's particularly relevant to the Australian opportunity. On the left, this map shows a map of the Australian coast, indicating regions which are accessible to fixed platforms where water depths are less than 60 metres deep, and those where the resource would only be applicable to floating technologies where the water depth is greater than 60 metre threshold. And we indicate only the areas which are proximal to existing electricity infrastructure or substations. And that proximal is a 100 metre distance threshold. And what we see is that the areas where we have the strongest grid, particularly through the New South Wales and South East Queensland, it's really are dependent on the access to floating technologies that will be able to have input into those opportunities. The bar chart on the right is to really look at the magnitude of that accessible resource by state and accessibility. And in total, we identify a potential resource of over 2,000 gigawatt for Australia, and emphasise that floating technologies will really be necessary to access many of the best locations. So that's all I want to say as an introduction. I'm now going to hand over. I think Gunilla is going to introduce Sven, and I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and thanks for your interest in this research.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Mark. I think you've really shown, and this report's shown, the quality and the potential of the offshore wind resources and the opportunities that we have. So a great start. And yes, I'd like to immediately introduce our third speaker, Dr. Sven Teske, who is an Associate Professor and Research Director at the Institute of Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney, and holds a PhD in economics from the University of Flensburg in Germany. His passion and interests are in energy decarbonisation pathways, and has experienced in solar and on and offshore wind power grid integration concepts and renewable energy markets and policy analysis. And thus I'm sure he'll be well placed to help us uncover more of those real potential benefits of offshore wind in Australia. So I'll hand it over to you, Sven.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to speak to our new research findings. As you probably hear from my accent, I'm from Germany, from Flensburg, where I did my PhD, which is on the Danish border. So Flensburg speaks basically Danish and German. So we were involved, I was involved very early in the debate of offshore wind, which started in the mid-1990s. Can I please have the next slide? So what we did is we did an analysis of the onshore, offshore and solar resources around Australia. We used the data available at the database called Renewable Ninja, which is a global database from the university, from the ETH Zurich in Europe. And basically this database gives you all the solar and onshore and offshore wind resources globally for different geographical points. It is important to mention that this data is basically, it's theoretical data, an average over many years. So the actual measured data is usually more exact, but obviously we could not have measured offshore wind data from the coast. The experience in Germany and Denmark is that the projected offshore wind data, and then after offshore wind farms were installed, and there are about 3,000 to 4,000 megawatts in the German part installed offshore wind, that the actual performance of those offshore wind farms were actually much better, 10 to 20% better than projected. So I just wanted to mention that the data we use is theoretical data based on meteorological data and not real measured generated from generation, from specific power generations. Can I get the next slide, please? So what we did is we did an analysis of the infrastructure on land. So even though there are good wind resources basically all around Australia, especially if you draw a line from Brisbane to Perth, everything south of that, it's basically compared to European circumstances marvelous. You still have to have infrastructure. So we went through the grid plans, the power grid plans, and see where the high voltage lines are and where the transmission substation close to the coast are. So we selected 12 sites. There's especially to mention in Tasmania, Chapel Street, sort of the Hobart area, but also the bus link, the southern part of the bus link in Tasmania, then the northern part of the bus link in Latrobe Valley, near the Latrobe Valley, and Newcastle with lots of power plants right now. That means the power plant infrastructure, the power grids are very strong and capable to accept more loads and more electricity. So we basically tap into the big substations close to the coastline. Next slide, please. So in order to compare the performance of offshore wind farms with onshore wind farms and utility scale solar, we selected for each state sort of reference solar PV power plants and reference onshore wind farms. Again, the data we took was from the meteorological data from that Renewable Ninja database, not from the actual power plants itself, because we use the locations where the power plants are, so the onshore wind farms and the solar utility scale power plants, but we did not use their actual generation data because we did not have access to that. So we looked at the generation profile for solar and onshore wind. We looked at the load profile for each state and the NAM, and compared it to the offshore generation profile we calculated in hourly steps. And we only mapped the potential 1,000 kilometers, 100 kilometers from the coastline and 1,000 meters water depth. So that's seen as the maximum water depth for floating offshore wind turbines. Can I get the next slide, please? So in order to show you some results, in Victoria, for example, the Latrobe bus link location, we use as a reference onshore wind farm, the MacArthur wind farm, which is about 600 kilometers west of Melbourne, and the Namukar solar farm, 250 kilometers north of Melbourne. So those are the two reference cases. Then we have the load curve of Victoria, and we compared it with 3 locations from offshore wind farms off the coast of the Latrobe Valley, which is 25 kilometers away, 50 kilometers away, and 100 kilometers away. We compared the output of those specific wind farms with a theoretical installed capacity. So we said, okay, we have 1,000 megawatts, 25 kilometers offshore, 1,000 megawatts 50, and 1,000 megawatts 100 kilometers offshore, and compared that with 6,000 megawatts onshore wind and 6,000 megawatt onshore solar. That's not a suggestion for the electricity mix in the future. It's just to compare different variable power generation technologies with a capacity and the electricity need of a whole state like Victoria. So we would have 15,000 megawatts installed solar and wind, onshore and offshore, and which need to provide 9,200 megawatts of load in Victoria, peak load, and an annual generation of 45,000 gigawatt hours, sorry. So this is a comparison, and we compared first how is the performance in terms of the capacity factor onshore wind to offshore wind, and we found that the correlation onshore wind to offshore wind is between 35 and 38%. So basically the performance of offshore wind is higher. That means that for each installed megawatt, we get more output, more generation, because the capacity factor is higher. I would like to explain the capacity factor. The capacity factor is basically a theoretical number. In Germany, we actually do not say capacity factor, we say full load hours, and we calculate how many hours per year a turbine operates under full load. So that means if a 1 megawatt turbine has 3,000 full load hours, it produces 3,000 megawatt hours a year. But that doesn't mean that 3,000 hours a year the wind turbine produces something, and the remaining 5,600 hours there's no output. Usually it's the case that the wind turbines generate to 80 or 90% of the year some electricity, which can be forecasted to a plus minus 5% error, about 48 to 78 hours ahead of time. So which means wind farms, onshore, offshore, but also solar, are predictable. They are not intermittent. Solar and wind always, or quite often, is described as an intermittent source. But that is not true. Intermittent would be surprise that the generation takes place. It is not a surprise. So the correlation is relatively high with onshore wind, but there is hardly any correlation with solar. So that means the combination from onshore wind, onshore solar, utility scale solar power plants and offshore wind is very good because they produce on different times. Going to the next slide, there's another example, and we actually have 12 of them, but don't worry, I just talked to 2 of them. This is Newcastle. Again, Newcastle is a very good location for offshore wind in terms of the expected output. It has a very good sort of onshore infrastructure in terms of grid connection, but also harbour facilities. It is very important that there is a facility for deep water ships, so tugboats and supplier can actually land equipment there. That's a very important criteria as well. We compared it with a Goulburn wind farm, which is 200 kilometers southwest of Sydney, and the Darling Point solar farm 600 kilometers west of Sydney. So we compared onshore and offshore. And again, we found a very high correlation, or a medium correlation with onshore wind, which is around 32%. We found that offshore wind further away, like further than 50 kilometers away from the coast in Newcastle is not viable because the water depth is more than 1,000 meters. So basically, the offshore wind farm needs to be installed 25 kilometers off the coast, which is sort of within the range of visibility, but just. In theory, a theoretical value number is that the offshore wind farm can be seen in a distance of 40 kilometers. Otherwise, after 40 kilometers, it disappears after the curve of the planet, basically. So you won't see a 50-kilometer offshore wind farm because it's behind the curve. 25 kilometers is still very hard to see because the masts are very sort of small, they're thin. So it's very hard to see them, and the visibility must be very good. Again, the correlation to solar is very low. So offshore wind and solar, they support each other very well. Next slide, please. This is a visualization. I selected the worst week during a year in terms of solar and wind generation, and the best week in Newcastle. We did this again for 12 locations. So the upper graph on the upper right side shows the black line is the demand curve. That's the load curve of New South Wales. And then you see orange and yellow solar generation. Orange is utility scale and yellow is rooftop. And then the different blues are offshore wind and onshore wind. Light blue is onshore wind. And you see that there are quite a few gaps which need to be filled with storage or with other power generation sources. And the lower part shows the best week in that analysis. And that means that with very little storage, the supply for the New South Wales part of the NEM could be maintained and could be supplied. And the red lines sort of in the negative are the storage facilities required for that. Next slide. Those are, we call them the fruit bowl figures. So it looks a bit like a fruit bowl. It basically just shows the overlap of onshore wind, offshore wind, and solar. And without going too much into detail, the less the overlap, the better basically the interaction between solar and wind. And we see that all the three locations, Latrobe, Newcastle, and Gladstone, have some overlap, but have also quite a few generation times, quite a bit of generation times apart, which means it's a very good interaction between solar, onshore wind, and offshore wind. And for me, it's very important also to say that there is not a competition between is onshore wind better than offshore wind. We need both in order to supply, have a security of supply. And I think it's a very good interaction between both technologies. Next slide. This is the example from the Star of the South contribution and projected to a peak electricity demand in Victoria. And on the left side, the graph, and that has been provided by the Star of the South. That's not my work. It shows that the blue line is basically the suggested or the projected contribution of the Star of the South. And it shows that it's a very high probability that the offshore wind farm will actually generate electricity when the demand is there. And it's in comparison to wind and solar projects in Victoria. Next slide, and that's my last slide. No, that was my last slide, and I would like to hand over to Chris. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Sven. That was some great explanations there, which are very interesting. I did like the fruit bowls, and I spent a bit of time looking at them in the report, and I'm sure we'll have some more discussions about that during the panel session. But let's get on to our fourth and final speaker before we get to that panel session. Dr. Chris Briggs is the Research Director also for the Institute of Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney, and Technical Director of the Business Renewables Centre. He has a combination of climate, energy, and labour market expertise working in roles including political advisor, policy maker, program leader, and of course researcher. So I'm very interested to hear his insights, understand it into the job transition area and the impact, I suppose, of this offshore wind for Australia. So I'll hand it to you, Chris.
Thanks very much. Yes, I'm going to cover three aspects: the employment in offshore wind energy, some of the development pathways that we considered when we tried to look at the employment implications. Broadly, we looked at two potential pathways, being supplying into the local market and what role offshore wind might play under the energy superpower visions that are being developed. And thirdly, I'll wrap up by looking at some of our report recommendations. Next slide. So we used scenarios to analyse potential employment, partly because it's a new industry, partly because data is a little bit patchy, and partly because there are a range of uncertainties, such as how much local capacity there will be, or local content there will be in the supply chain and manufacturing. Obviously, the construction and the operations and maintenance are done locally, but the level of local manufacturing is uncertain. So the way we approached this was to generate an employment factor, which is the labour intensity for construction, manufacturing and O&M, expressed as full-time equivalent work over a megawatt. And we used a study by the International Renewable Energy Agency from 2019, a survey of OECD and non-OECD nations as the high estimate. And we used a review of other secondary sources and primary project data as the low estimate. So the employment factor in O&M is quite similar between the two. In construction, it's less than half in the low, and in the manufacturing area, it's around 2/3 in the low scenario. For manufacturing share, we also did a scenario which, that should say 10% local content, actually not 5% local content. In general, our share of manufacturing in onshore renewable energy is quite low. So we used 10% as sort of the standard, or in the low scenario, I should say. And we used 25% in the high scenario. 25% is basically drawn from the UK, who've tried to use a more active industry policy to increase the local share. And so we basically use that as a reasonable benchmark. It's not to say it couldn't be higher, but that's a reasonable stretch target, if you like. And so with that, we then applied those employment factors to development scenarios to try and look at what the employment potential might be. Next slide. So in thinking about that, I guess it raised some interesting questions as to what are the different pathways for offshore wind? Because of course, we have very high quality onshore resources, which are a good quality and low cost, and they're clearly going to dominate development in coming years. But I think there's two potential development pathways for offshore wind, and good reasons why it might come to play a role in our local market. Firstly, costs are continuing to fall. There's a quite staggering level of global development happening and technology development happening. And so as you saw earlier from Mark's slide, more or less cost parity is projected by 2030 by the UK government. The benefits that offshore provides, that Sven has run through in terms of diversifying our generation mix and complementing onshore renewables and what that might have for the amounts of storage we require. Thirdly, the ability to install very large volumes in a single project, 1.5 to 3 gigawatts, and to be able to connect it into very strong parts of the grid could be a very valuable resource, particularly as our energy transition accelerates. We don't really know when and how quickly coal plants will retire in the coming years, and the ability to install large volumes into the strongest parts of the network off the coast of Latrobe and Hunter could be quite a valuable resource in managing some of the risks around energy transition. And in general, as we start to build out onshore renewables up to around 50 gigawatts under IEMO's step change scenario, then I think it's reasonable to expect that some of the risks and costs will also scale up, be it around land use conflicts, be it around transmission, be it around community support and social licence. Next slide. That is especially so if we are to realise the visions of becoming an energy superpower. So the energy superpower scenario envisages Australia replacing or supplementing initially and replacing its coal and LNG exports with the export of green hydrogen with the development of green steel powered by hydrogen and large-scale electrification. And the scale of electricity requirements under these scenarios are quite staggering, really. So the table on the right is data that we've applied from the National Hydrogen Strategy. And you'll see in the largest scenario, hydrogen energy of the future, they project electricity requirements of 912 terawatt hours. So our national electricity market at the moment is around 200 terawatt hours. So we're talking about over 4.5 times the existing market. If we are building out, not only trying to replace our NEM, the national electricity market, but also talking about 4, 5, and maybe even larger volumes. I've seen other scenarios with sort of 6.5 times the NEM. Arena is talking about 1,000% renewable energy. If we are talking about electricity requirements of that scale, being able to build large-scale offshore wind farms near ports, near industrial facilities, either to directly produce hydrogen or to power electrolysis units onshore, is likely to be, I think, a strategic and important resource. So what we did then, I guess, in thinking about how employment might develop, our scenario includes a certain amount of production for the local market. So essentially 4 large projects, but fundamentally what we projected or used was a scaling up of offshore wind to meet requirements under a superpower scenario, with 27 gigawatts being built from 2030 to 2050. And if that sounds like quite a lot, I think it's worth noting it's only around 10% of the generation that we required under the largest scenario. So I want to stress that it's not a model scenario. It doesn't underlie costs or anything like that. It's an illustrative scenario which was fundamentally developed to understand employment, but I guess we were looking for something which also was plausible and could fit the pattern of development. Next slide. So to those employment results, you can see it scales up from around sort of 3,000-4,000 jobs up to around a peak of 7,000 to 8,000 jobs, depending on the scenario. Remembering again that the lows, you can see the low scenarios in the reddish ones with the different local content, and the blues using the higher employment factors. The variability is fundamentally reflecting construction timetables with a growing proportion of operation and maintenance jobs over time. Next slide. And what we know also is that there's a good skills match, in particular with offshore oil and gas. So this colourful graph is from the UK, where it's quite a detailed assessment of the skills match. And roughly around 2/3 they find has a good or some skills match between offshore oil and gas and offshore wind. They found fundamentally 3 pathways into the industry. One was out of offshore oil and gas and associated energy industries. And it's worth noting that there is an opportunity here for the coal sector as well. There's likely to be requirements for port assembly and engineering jobs. And so if we're building projects off the coast of the Hunter and Latrobe, then there's also likely to be potential employment for the coal workforce. Second pathway are new apprenticeships and trainees. And the third pathway are people with cross skills. So, for example, finance professionals. I think it's interesting to note that it's a highly skilled workforce in oil and gas in general. So between them, managers and professionals make up around 60%, and trades and technicians make up a further 25%. Next slide. So then looking at the volumes and how it compares with offshore oil and gas, down the bottom you can see in the green, the 2 shades of green and what should be 2 shades of blue, the average full-time workforce. So it's around sort of 3,000 to 5,000, and how that compares to the total oil and gas workforce. Data on the offshore workforce is actually quite thin, but we were able to source some data out of NAPISMA, which is a safety body, and applying assumptions around shift lengths, you can see the offshore workforce is around, it fluctuates in and around 5,000. So it's a reasonable match in terms of volume as well. Now, these are obviously not really large numbers of jobs in the scheme of things, but I think as we learn more and more about the challenges of transitioning coal, oil and gas workers, we see that there isn't a simple switch out, there isn't a simple replacement. And what we're really trying to look for are the sectors that can offer the sort of right type of jobs in the right places. And I think in the case of offshore wind, you're not really going to find a better match for offshore oil and gas anywhere else. So it's got a significant role to play potentially in a just transition. Next slide. So report recommendations, there's 10 of them. I don't think I will go through all of them for time reasons. But the key ones are that firstly, there are regulatory barriers. We don't really have an offshore regulatory regime at the moment. I think it's been under consideration now for about a year by the Commonwealth. And that's obviously an urgent priority. Also need to think about the interaction between Commonwealth and state. I'm sure Sven can tell you at length, I think, about the three. I think in Germany it needed 3 regulatory authorities to approve offshore wind projects, and obviously getting the lineup between different jurisdictions will be important. The second group of recommendations goes to the importance of incorporating offshore wind into planning. So offshore wind wasn't included, for example, in the original assessments for the renewable energy zones by IEMO in its ISP. And I think we're now at a point where it needs to be incorporated. It'll look more expensive at this point, but it needs to be properly evaluated against other sources, and should be also incorporated in other relevant processes such as the National Hydrogen Strategy. Next slide. I think also it should be a priority, or there should be funding allocated to ARENA and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation for innovation development. I think back to the role that the 2 agencies played in accelerating the development of large solar by helping to de-risk it, by helping to bring down the cost of capital, by helping to develop sort of local project expertise, and think that that's a role that it could also play for offshore wind, particularly because we'll need to see the development of floating wind, which is sort of just at that early deployment, early commercialisation stage. Secondly, there's potential to use the permitting process, I think, to leverage the local supply chain development, because similar to what's been done through auctions in the ACT and Victoria, because there will be leverage from the permitting process, it does open up opportunities for local content requirements, which could develop, for example, wind tower manufacturing. And that's something we should be trying to actively encourage as well. Finally, we acknowledge that there needs to be a lot more detailed research, particularly around baseline data on environmental impacts and social dimensions of offshore wind energy. It's obviously very early days for the industry, and more work needs to be done on that. So I guess to sum up then, it's been, I guess, conventional wisdom that offshore wind is not going to have a role to play in Australia, as we've heard, but we think it's time to reconsider that. I think our report shows that we have high quality offshore wind resources, that it can play important roles complementing onshore renewables and reducing some of the risks of energy transition and supporting workforce transition. And that if we are to realise the vision of being an energy superpower, the scale of offshore wind is likely to make it a really strategic resource. Obviously, there are uncertainties around the development of offshore wind, like any technology. But I think it would be wise for us to look at how we can bring on an offshore wind sector to add to the portfolio of technologies that we have, to help us navigate the wild ride that is the Australian energy transition. If we're going to realise some of these visions, we're going to need all the different technologies. So thank you very much, and look forward to taking questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Chris. Yes, well, I think Leslie, can you, or Mark first, yeah, take us off that and now come together as a panel. So firstly, can I welcome Penny Howard from the Manufacturers Union of Australia. She's replacing Michelle O'Neill, who had an urgent matter and had to leave. So welcome, Penny, and thank you for being here. I suppose I've been just having an eye on some of the Q&A, and we'll try and get stuck into it a bit more detail. But I think the first thing I should really raise is that there has been a lot of support and comment congratulating the unions that have been involved, showing the leadership that you have and the support for this work. And maybe, therefore, I'll give Penny you the floor just to ask, you know, what are the next steps for you, do you see, in this space, or the challenges that you see? So before we get into some of the tech questions and the other interesting areas, I mean, we'd really appreciate your view.
Oh, thanks very much. And of course, thanks to everyone who's worked so hard on this report as well. This is such important information for us to go forward, but you know, ultimately there are a lot of political questions. There's a question of what's going to happen with the regulatory framework, the fact that we need one, and we need one also that's robust and fit for purpose as well. The federal government has put $4.8 million into that in its last budget. And they were saying they were hoping to have that in place by July this year, by now. Unfortunately, we haven't seen that as yet. But there is that commitment there, and they have started that consultation process. Unfortunately, that does mean that there are projects that did want to start doing exploration that have not been able to. So there was a question in the chat about that. The government's been aware of some of these projects since about 2015, but there have been, since the Star of the South was issued with its exploration permit, there's been, I think, projects off Port Kembla, Newcastle, and also further western in Gippsland that applied for licenses that were told they had to wait for the legislation. And then there's the whole question of our energy planning. So that's through the integrated system plan, and there's recommendations in the report about how to better integrate that, and also the energy planning that's happening at a state level as well. So there's quite a lot of processes happening right now with the New South Wales government, but the question of what role offshore wind will play with that is currently unresolved. The Victorian government is taking some great initiatives around that, and hopefully there'll be a more comprehensive plan going forward. But the fact that we've had this gap means that there's a lot of catching up to do, basically across all energy jurisdictions. There might be one other question. There's a question about the role of what are the future jobs for workers in the coal industry. A lot of that will depend on location. So absolutely, in the construction, the skills that maritime workers have, that seafarers have in building the offshore oil and gas industry in Australia are directly transferable to building the kinds of structures and the kinds of vessels that will need to be operated for the offshore wind industry. But the other thing that we've got is the ability to locate these projects in areas where we do have coal-fired power stations and big coal export ports. And that's going to hopefully allow us to keep generation jobs in those areas, develop supply chains in those areas, diversify coal export ports, such as we have in Newcastle, in Port Kembla, and provide some of those ongoing jobs in the Gippsland area as well. So it's that geographical match, but there's also engineering and other skills there that can hopefully be applied in this new industry as well. And of course, most of the jobs for a lot of this stuff are in manufacturing, and government policy is going to make a huge difference as to the extent to which a real supply chain can be established in Australia. And that's actually where most of the jobs are. Chris has got some great figures on that in the report. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you, Penny. Well, I mean, maybe because we're on that sort of topic, there's a question here about the report's focus mainly on the transition opportunities for oil and gas workers and less focus on coal workers, which is exactly what you were just saying there, Penny. Maybe can one of the other panelists, maybe Chris, start? Does it offer fewer opportunities for coal workers? I mean, you talked about there was a 3/4 overlap in skills, I think, in the oil and gas. Is it similar in the coal industry, or can you provide some input?
So we have I guess it depends on which part you're talking about, but if you're talking about coal mining, for example, you've got quite a large volume of semi-skilled machine operators and truck drivers. And so not necessarily a match for those parts of the industry, but there's plenty of other areas like around the electricals and mechanical skills that could well find roles within, particularly at the port assembly and engineering part, as we discussed. I guess our focus is obviously on offshore oil and gas because it's such an obvious fit and it's a problematic part of the workforce. I guess how do you find alternative jobs that fit? And offshore wind is such a perfect one. So I think the answer is that there will be opportunities. Also, the offshore oil and gas industry is primarily concentrated in Western Australia and Victoria present, so there's a location issue. So the answer is yes, but obviously it screens out as a good match for offshore oil and gas primarily.
Yes. Did anyone else want to make a comment on that? I was interested, in the report, the interpretation I had, particularly around the Newcastle, Gladstone, Gippsland, Port Kembla locations, was that they have the workers in infrastructure. And there was really quite a good correlation between the onshore and offshore wind from what I could generally gather. Maybe you can clarify that for me. Yet they seem to have the lowest capacity factor, and as you showed, particularly Newcastle, that couldn't go further offshore. So I'm just wondering, what are the issues there, and when are those projects, what's going to trigger those projects to really get going? I'm handing it to anyone.
Yeah. Maybe I can jump in. Maybe I'm just starting with the international experience. I came to Australia 6 years ago, and until before I lived in North Germany, where the offshore wind industry sort of started in the 2000s. So it's established now around 10-15 years. And one of the reasons why offshore wind took off there was not actually the generation cost, was actually the workforce, because the shipyards lost a lot of jobs especially to Taiwan and to the Far East. So the German shipping industries actually suffered. So they saw offshore wind as a new way of actually getting very high unemployment rate down. I'm from the North Sea coast. In my hometown, we had 35% unemployment rate because of that. So now the offshore wind supplies a lot of jobs there. Also, the harbour facilities are extremely important. You need good harbour facilities. You need actually quite large quay sites to install the wind turbines. The wind turbine blades are massive. They're 70, 80 meters wide. There's heavy engineering. What you need is very large quay sites, very good harbour facilities. You definitely have that. For example, you find that in Newcastle, but also in other sort of working harbours, which we checked. Secondly, in terms of the electricity capacity factor is one thing. The other thing is how stable it is, and the winds are very stable in the if I stick to the example, Newcastle area, is quite stable. So it's very predictable. So it's a very good interaction between a rather predictable offshore wind and then solar, which is extremely easy to predict because you know when sunrise and sunset is. That never comes as a surprise. So you also know when you don't have the electricity, which is actually quite a lot of, that's very valid to know that. And then the onshore wind resource is usually not right next to the harbour, but we see that the onshore wind farms in New South Wales are further inland and further southwest. So the interaction of that, because they are all interconnected in the NEM, they are very good in terms of how they sort of work with each other. And then there's a possibility of demand-side management at some point in time. But I think that the whole package of there is a harbour available, there's the infrastructure available, there are large power lines, there are skilled workers, and there is sort of a very good predictable wind and solar resource all this together actually makes the case for offshore wind. And also, as my last remark, the European wind industry basically were really divided. And so the onshore wind against offshore wind, I would strongly recommend not to repeat that in Australia again. Onshore wind and offshore wind are two sides of the same coin. It's both required, and it does not make sense to fight against each other and say our onshore wind is more important than offshore wind and the other way around. We need a whole variety of different technologies, and offshore wind is one of the big three, and even the conservative International Energy Agency now says that.
Well, I think that's a really good message, and I think why the report was actually quite eye-opening for me, thinking about that it hasn't been incorporated within the mix really at all, which that seems a bit crazy. I should point out that the photo behind me is a beach off Newcastle, Burwood Beach. So I suppose we won't see the wind generators on the horizon, but they will be beyond that, from what I can understand. I think something else Penny sort of touched on was around the regulation side, and there's a question around that regarding the federal regulation of offshore wind. I suppose I wasn't going to really push the panelists on whether they've delayed too long, et cetera, but more really are related around the fact that there are major barriers to investment and development if we don't get this regulation going, and also the regulation or the need to ensure that we have both Commonwealth and state and local governments involved with this because of the complementary processes and activities that are required. So yeah, I wondered if we could have just a little more of a discussion about where and how are we going to get this moving so that it can be a complementary resource to onshore wind. And I'm not sure if, Mark, do you wanted to start, or Sven, back to you?
I can have a bash, but I think it will be backed up well by the other panelists. I think this was really the key motivation for this piece of work, was to really motivate and bring offshore wind into Australia's energy discourse at the moment, because I think for a long time it has been missing, and I think Chris wrapped up well in his presentation in terms of saying that there's a large opportunity here that has been missing in that discussion. I think the interest in this presentation and the report kind of shows that I think that we have turned a corner a little bit in terms of recognising the opportunity that offshore wind might have. And I made the point in the few slides that I presented around the opportunity knocking at the door in Australia. So I would say that that investment opportunity is knocking on the door. They're being quite polite, and I think if we don't answer that door, that investment is likely to go elsewhere, and that would be a lost opportunity for Australia. And so I think there is a timeliness aspect to this that has to be considered in the discussion.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Sven or Chris, do you want to make a comment around that regulation and how to move forward?
Maybe again from my international experience, it's very important to have it streamlined. So, for example, in the beginning, when the German offshore wind industry started, you have a project, let's say 15 miles offshore. 50 miles offshore is federal. Then you go into the 3-mile zone, then you need to apply for the state. And if you approach the beach or the dike, you're in council area. And you basically had to apply everywhere. So there were offshore wind projects, they had approval from federal and from the council, but not from the state. So basically the cable at 10 miles in between could not be built. And this is, I think, lessons learned not to repeat that, because that delayed the whole industry by 5, 6, 7 years. And it was very expensive, and quite a few investors actually went bankrupt in that time, because they just couldn't get any finance at that time. So streamlined policy for approval and for grid connection. Grid connection is absolutely key. So it's important that once the offshore wind farms are connected to the grid, they have priority dispatch, so they can actually deliver the electricity. That's important.
Yeah, no, no, I hear you. Thank you. Chris, did you have something to say?
I think only to add that one of the key aims of this report was to try and, as Mark says, bring it into the discourse. And we don't see this as the final word, you know, or the definitive study by any means. It's an exploratory study, really. And so the regulation is one aspect, but I think we would also, it's really important that it starts to be properly integrated into the planning and analysis that is going on across the energy sector. And I guess, like any industry, it takes some time to develop. And so it's also important that I think we start to see it considered as important from a strategic and an innovation perspective, and what needs to happen to develop the industry. So there's a regulatory story, but there's also a kind of a planning and analysis and an innovation development story, I think, that's needed to bring offshore wind on.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's great.
I could just add to that. I think that's absolutely critical. I mean, the lowest level of what we need is to allow projects that are proposed to be able to proceed. But that's actually considering kind of the scale of the climate crisis that we're facing, the scale of the transition challenge for the grid, and the potential to actually, you know, build out further beyond that with those kind of energy superpower scenarios that have been outlined. There's more work that needs to be done than just allowing projects to proceed. And that needs to be planned alongside the rest of energy planning in Australia. And it needs to be planned as part of what's going to happen for the communities and the workforces that have hosted existing generation capacity in Australia so far. And it's a great point that Sven made, was that in Germany, they actually planned the new generation that was going to be built looking at what are the social considerations. And we've got a challenge in Australia right now where energy planning is very tightly focused on a very narrow measure of lowest cost that doesn't actually look at those broader considerations, which are costs, which we're all going to bear. And there are also political obstacles as well. Certainly one thing the current government is looking at, is proposing, is that this would mainly be, the regulation of the industry would be mainly be dealt with through NOPSEMA. We've got reservations around that because we think it really needs to be very fully integrated into the planning for the electricity system. And that system needs to be looked at as an integrated whole. And we particularly need the safety and WHS aspects to be integrated across there, and ensure that as we develop the new industry, that workers have got the opportunity to participate in making sure that it's a safe industry and have got the same rights as the workforce on land.
Yeah, no, that's great. No, thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, well, let's move. We've got one of the top voted questions is a technical question, as Glenn points out. So I'll ask that of the panel. I don't mind who'd like to start answering this. So although the report is highlighting the better capacity factor of offshore wind, a related issue is variability. So onshore wind suffers from one key weakness, which is the occurrence of wind drought, where wind can die for several days at a time over large areas. From the wind survey data in this project, does offshore wind have similar issues? And I think you've said in some areas it doesn't, but would you like to expand on that?
I think that was my part. We did not find that, actually, that total hole, let's say that wind hole where there's nothing. I was surprised because I was particularly looking for it, because Europe has that every January, and it's ice cold over the North Sea. There's no wind, it's minus 20 degrees, and there's no wind. And that's sort of for about 3 weeks. And that's where the electricity supply is quite high because it's really cold. We did not find that supply hole in our data here. So it's much better. It's very, very, very well and very reliable, actually. The wind speed varies, but there's hardly any time, I actually couldn't find any time other than maybe 100 hours a year where there was 0 or under 3 meters per second, which is basically when the wind turbines cut out of 4 meters. So the answer is no.
No. That's great. I mean, that's good. Did any of the other panelists want to say anything? No? Got another great question here. How do you see the fabrication and installation supply chain working within Australian context for both fixed and floating technologies?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it's a bit of an open question as to how it develops. I think there's some obvious real opportunities around wind tower manufacturing, for example, but it's probably not something that happens without active policy and a coordinated industrial policy. Obviously, the big wind OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, have their existing supply chains, but there are some potential benefits to local supply. And via, as I said, the permitting role, there's certainly an opportunity to include local content requirements, which have driven the use of local tower manufacturing in Victoria. So that's a question for policymakers. I mean, there's always a balance between, I guess, getting some local content, which is cost effective, and not putting on requirements that are going to drive the cost up too much of the technology, but there are cost effective opportunities or ones that add modest levels of cost to offshore turbines that could be developed here. And I guess that's why we use the UK benchmark as what looked like a comparable jurisdiction and a reasonable approach to the question.
Chris, actually, while you have the floor, in your presentation, you talked about the different pathways, and I think Mark actually also mentioned the cost parity with onshore and offshore wind by 2030. That doesn't include floating wind. I'm assuming that's more expensive. Is that right?
It's more expensive now, but I think the projections are that floating wind will in fact go past fixed bottom. So the 2030 projection, I believe, does include floating turbines.
All right. Okay.
I just want to add to floating. The advantage of floating is that you can actually install the turbine in the harbour, and then you have tugboats and tug them out. There are a few projects right now in Norway where they have an oil and gas industry where the wells are basically empty, so they have to transition, and they use their equipment. There was a project of Shell using the floating device and Siemens sort of the wind turbine on top, and they were actually able to install the system in the harbour. Like, so for example, in Newcastle, you have that T-side and everything, and then you have a set of tugboats and just pull them out, and that's a easier way to install than installing at sea, because the problem with installing at sea is if you have more than, let's say, a 2 meter swell, you can't actually work. So you need to have then jack-up platforms and stuff, but then you need to have a shallow sort of area. So floating offshore has quite a lot of advantages also in installation.
Okay. Right.
If I could just add to that, in terms of how a supply chain could roll out, there's a fantastic opportunity that we're looking at right now. You know, if you just look at, for example, in New South Wales, we've got major steel manufacturer, we've got ports that have got space and existing capacity, particularly in Newcastle, Port Kembla. We've got a workforce that's got, you know, all sorts of engineering, manufacturing, machinery skills. We've got coal-fired power stations that are set to shut down. So there's really the opportunity to bring all those things together and put together a hub, a center of excellence, or whatever you want to call it, that could really push the development of the floating offshore wind further and become like a global leader in developing that technology and rolling it out in a way that would be incredibly beneficial in all sorts of areas. So that's the kinds of things that we could be developing in Australia if we can take a proper coordinated approach to doing that.
Thank you. That's great. And Mark, I see that you're unmuted. Did you have something to say?
No, I think Penny's just covered the points that I was going to refer to very well. So.
Well, look, we have to finish soon, but I mean, there is a question here. I think we should give a couple of minutes to maybe Mark, if you'd like to answer. The question, it's clear from the presentation and experience elsewhere in the world that offshore wind is potentially a great clean energy resource. What are the major barriers to development? And in particular, they go on saying, I don't see social license, stakeholders, workforce skills and capacity, supply chain, infrastructure, etc. as barriers. Do the panelists? Can you answer that in a couple of minutes?
Yeah, so I guess I'll take the opportunity to speak about a couple of elements that we haven't covered at all in the webinar to now, and that's around social and environmental concerns, if you like. So I think it's fair to say that the social licence for offshore wind in Australia hasn't seriously been tested yet. I think the Star of the South project has gone a long way, and there's certainly positive signals in terms of the support for that project, and so I think that's setting the tone in Australia, and I think they're carrying out their project very well in terms of their engagement with communities and such like. So I think that's somewhere to get. In terms of some of the environmental concerns that arise with offshore wind, I think it's worth saying that Australia certainly isn't an early adopter of this technology, and so there's a lot of international learnings to take. And Sven's made the point in terms of work in Germany and through the North Sea, that there are a lot of learnings around environmental interactions and how to site offshore wind farms and how they interact with environmental systems, but then also how offshore wind can sit within allocation of marine space and interaction with other marine users. And so I think in the recommendation that Chris reeled off at the end in terms of understanding some of those cost benefit trade-offs, if you like, between different sectors, this report is really to try and motivate some of that discussion and research in terms of understanding some of those aspects in an Australian context. I think that's all I'll say. I'll give opportunity to the others to speak.
Right. No, thank you very much. And look, unfortunately, we've run out of time. I know there's so many more questions, but I'm about to share my screen and talk about another event that's coming up in this space, which I think is going to be very exciting. I just wanted, while we're all on screen, to thank you all, to thank Michelle, who is absent now, but Penny, thank you for coming on and contributing to the panel session. I'm going to just move to this last slide, which is the next event. Sorry, oh, no. So this is an industry panel session that we've got on the opportunity offshore wind in Australia. It's going to happen on Tuesday, the 10th of August at 3 p.m. So you can go to the events page on the Blue Economy CRC website and register for that. That will be a great event. And then I just wanted to finish off also by saying that we have recorded this session, so there's been a few questions around that. So it will be a couple of days before it goes up on the website, but you'll be able to find it on the events part of our website. And so then lastly, I want to remind you of our hashtag. Please continue to use it in this space for us to keep promoting not only this report, but this area for us. And keep an eye on the Blue Economy CRC website. There's lots of information there on all the work that's being done. So again, finally, thank you so much, panel. Brilliant. Really appreciate your time, and thank you to all the collaborators on this research, which was really fabulous. And thank you to the audience and for all your questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to them all, but I've really enjoyed the session today. So with that, I will say goodbye and thank you, and hopefully see you on the 10th of August. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, bye.